Hi, it's Katrina.
Number 10. The War on Cats. Pope Gregory IX ruled the Catholic Church between 1227 and 1241. It was a time of great paranoia. Europe was gripped by a fear of death, a fear of going to hell, and the fear that Satan was around every corner. When Pope Gregory announced to the world that cats were carriers for the spirit of the devil, he initiated a war on cat that would almost wipe felines off the face of the planet. Between approximately 1233 and 1234, cat fever gripped Europe. Those loyal to the church under direct orders of the Pope exterminated an impossible number of cats, and they were hunted down. Hysteria gripped England and mainland Europe alike, with many people believing cats were magical familiars of witches, their magical pets. The mad rush to murder cats ended only when the Pope finally excommunicated cats. People still hunted them here and there, and they remained hated for centuries to follow, but the main massacre ended. Shortly after, when the Black Plague showed up in Europe, it managed to kill almost half the human population because there weren't enough cats to fight off the swarms of plague-carrying rats. Number 9. William Tyndale. William Tyndale was an English scholar, priest, and enemy of the church. He was a talented English linguistics expert who made it his business to translate the Bible into English for the first time. Sadly for William, he was killed for it. The thing the Catholic Church doesn't want you to know is that up until William came along, they didn't want anyone to read the Bible. They controlled Scripture with an iron fist, and always had. The original Bible appeared near the end of the 4th century AD, and was later translated into Latin by Saint Jerome. The Church considered the Latin Vulgate Bible to be the one and only version, and expressly forbade any translation into any other country's national language, not just English. As you know, the Bible is a complex book. It is not a clear manual, but it is full of things that can be misinterpreted or confusing. So, by controlling the language of the Bible, the Church could be the sole interpreter of the Bible and keep the people close. Contradictory interpretations of the Bible could lead to conflict, and eventually did, resulting in over 300 different Christian denominations. It was better for the Church to keep a tight grip on the Word of God. In the 1500s, William Tyndale first asked for permission in England, but was denied. He had originally wanted to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek. When he was told not to do it, William translated and published the New Testament into English, and then smuggled the books into England. He believed that the Bible alone should determine the practice and doctrine of the Church, and all believers should be able to read the Bible in their own language. This was a big deal, because he had translated them straight from the Hebrew and Greek texts, not from the authorized Latin version. When the Church found out Tyndale was trying to make the Bible widely available for all people, they were furious. He fled to Germany to try to finish his translation of the New Testament and printed copies. He was captured later in Antwerp and condemned for heresy. In 1536, Tyndale was executed by strangulation and then burned at the stake. Number 8. The Banquet of Chestnuts. The Banquet of Chestnuts was one of the most despicable parties ever thrown by the Church. We don't know for sure if this is a historical event, as the only mention of it is preserved in a Latin diary written by Johann Burchard, the master of ceremonies for the Vatican. Johann wrote in his diary that Cardinal Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI, held the Banquet of Chestnuts on October 31st, 1501. You know the Borgias and their crazy reputation. The banquet was held within the papal palace itself, at the center of Vatican City. It was one of the most sinful things that ever happened here. Although, maybe not. The reason the banquet is seen as such a horrific thing for the Church is that there were at least 50 ladies of the night in attendance, if you know what I mean. They were the entertainment for the guests of the banquet, most of whom were the highest members of the Vatican. The Pope's own son had 50 ladies dance for the dinner guests, take their clothes off, crawl around on the floor, which was covered in chestnuts for some reason. Not only were the most important people in the Church present, but so was the Pope and the Pope's own daughter. And here's where things get truly disturbing. The Pope handed out prizes for who could be intimate with the most ladies. For all intents and purposes, this was a Vatican orgy of devilish proportions. The most sinful party guests were given prizes like tunics made of silk, fancy shoes, and nice hats. Experts in the church have denounced the diary as a fake. However, given the atrocious reputation of the church in the Middle Ages and the Borgia, the banquet shouldn't come as a huge surprise. Number 7. The Vatican's Hall of Shame. Pope Alexander VI was the man allegedly present during the Banquet of Chestnuts, but he was hardly the worst pope to have ruled the Papal States. The Vatican has a very special Hall of Shame, not an official one like the Hollywood Walk of Fame, but it exists in the records of history. The Vatican's Hall of Shame contains the names of some of the most disturbed, monstrous, and unholy popes that the Church desperately wants you to forget. Let's start with Pope Sergius III, who came into power in 904 after he murdered the Pope before him. He became fascinated with a teenage prostitute named Marozia, who was 30 years younger than him, and they had a son together. That son would grow to be the next in line to rule. He was Pope Anastasius III, and he was yet another notoriously awful pope who sold positions in the church for cash to make himself rich. Between 955 and 964 was Pope John XII, a man accused of romancing both his sisters. He was killed at the young age of 27 when he got caught in bed with a married woman and was beaten to death with a hammer. That really doesn't sound like something that should be happening to the Pope. Pope Benedict IX, who ruled between 1032 and 1048, had a problem with young boys. St. Peter Damian once described him as a wretch who feasts on immortality, and also as a demon from hell in the disguise of a priest. The list goes on and on. Pope Boniface VIII was known for his affair with a married woman and her daughter. He was so openly deviant that Dante reserved a special place for him in the 8th circle of hell. So, what do you think about the crazy Pope stories? Do you think they are all true? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more crazy history. Number 6. Indulgence. Indulgence was an old practice used by the church to make money off the absolution of sin. The original idea behind an indulgence was that if a person committed such a terrible sin that it couldn't be forgiven through mere absolution, they would need to pay a penance. This penance would be paid in cash to the church so that God wouldn't be so angry with the sinner. Indulgence worked because medieval people were terrified of both hell and purgatory. They firmly believed that if their sins were not forgiven, they would wind up in limbo for the rest of existence. Starting in the 11th century, the idea of purgatory swept across Europe. And while popes were running amok and clergy were as corrupt as could be, those in power decided to start making money from fear. Bishops were given the authority to dispense indulgences for the right price. So this means that you could pay your local bishop to be absolved of doing something atrocious, like murder, or something maybe even worse. Number 5. The Croatian Genocide. The Catholic Church openly supported a movement in World War II that would see one of the worst genocides in European history play out. This was the indiscriminate killing of Serbian, Jewish, and Roma people living in Yugoslavia. Catholic priests were willing accomplices from between 1941 and 1945, supporting the regime of Ante Pavelić in Croatia. Over 800,000 Yugoslavian citizens were killed, while the church watched and did absolutely nothing. The full story of the Catholic Church and the genocide is wildly complex and goes back centuries. To make things digestible, we're going to start with the invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece by Nazi Germany in April of 1941. The Nazis exploited ethnic divisions already alive in Yugoslavia and tried to label themselves as the good guys to the Croats, the ethnic people of Croatia. The Nazis helped to set up the independent state of Croatia, which at the time seemed to the locals like a good thing. But when the deputy prime minister refused to help operate the puppet government, the Ustase were put in charge. This was the fascist government of Croatia, with its origins going back to 1929. It was a puppet organization for Hitler to control. Once the puppet government was established, they began a ruthless campaign of persecution and murder of Serbians, Jewish people, and Gypsies. While this was happening, the church was busy forcing conversions on everyone they could get their hands on, including the Jewish people who would otherwise be slaughtered. Archbishop Stepinac of Zagreb was 100% complicit in the genocide, which resulted in the horrific loss of almost 1 million lives. And at the same time, the Vatican and Pope Pius XII refused to act or speak out. In fact, the Pope refused to speak out about the Nazi atrocities, sitting back and watching as the Holocaust unfolded. Many have blamed the Church for supporting what they were hoping would be a new world order, with no more Jewish or Muslim people. Number 4. The Magdalene Asylums. The Magdalene Asylums are a stain on the history of the Roman Catholic Church. The asylums were not designed to hold the mentally ill or criminally insane, but instead for women seen as unfit for society by the Church. Women who are accused of being promiscuous, young women who became pregnant outside of marriage, or any girl or teenager who did not have the support of her family. All of these young girls and women would be sent to the Magdalene Asylums. Once locked up in an asylum, they would be forced to work with no pay and given barely enough food to survive. They were like work camps that sprang up in World War II. The thing about the Magdalene Asylums, which were functional between the 18th and late 20th centuries, is that they were supposedly put together to treat and help women in need. Instead, the Church used them as free labor camps. These asylums were operational in the UK, Ireland, Canada, Australia, and the United States. The first one opened in England in 1758, and the last one didn't close until 1996. At the peak of the craze in 1900, there were about 300 asylums in England alone. Number 3. John Huss. On the morning of July 6, 1415, John Huss was led from his prison at the cathedral in Constance to an elevated platform. He had just spent 219 days incarcerated in the most despicable of conditions. It was nice to get some fresh air and be out of his jail cell. But after he was forced to listen to a sermon, the fresh air wasn't so great anymore. He was stripped of his clothes, marched through the streets in front of the people, and then burned alive at the stake. But what did John Huss do to deserve such brutal punishment? John Huss was one of the first reformers of the Church and the inspiration for the Hussitism movement that came after his death. He would also grow to be one of the major inspirations for Martin Luther, who sparked Protestantism as a kind of evolution to Hussitism. John first earned himself a degree in art, then became an officially ordained priest. He began to preach in Prague, Hungary, and openly opposed certain aspects of the Catholic Church. He was very outspoken about things like selling church offices, and he was particularly harsh on the church and its corruption. Pope Alexander V was so annoyed that a man was in opposition of the church, even though that man was an ordained priest, that he had him excommunicated. However, Alexander never followed through on the excommunication. When anti-Pope John XXIII came into office in 1410 and the corruption got even worse, John summoned Jan to finally be excommunicated officially. John Huss was informed that when he arrived for the meeting he would be kicked out of the church, but nothing bad would happen to him. This was a lie. When he got there, he was dragged into prison, kept in a cell for over 200 days, and then burned alive for heresy. These are the kinds of cruel murders and trickeries that the Church doesn't want you thinking about. Number 2. Unupsetting Mummy. In 2017, a group of people from Sudan asked the Vatican to give back the mummy of a revered ancient princess. The mummy was stolen by the British during colonialism, then handed over to the Vatican, who have been keeping her prisoner in their museum ever since. The group, which doesn't have an official name, called on the Vatican to return the mummified remains of Princess Amanirdis, daughter of King Kashta and Queen Pebatjama of the Kushite Empire. She was born in the 25th dynasty of ancient Egypt, though she wasn't Egyptian. She originated from the kingdom of Kush, located in modern-day Sudan. She would grow to be a fierce woman, taking power in 714 BC and ruling over the kingdom as high priestess until 700 BC. She was also the sister of Pharaoh Shabaka and Pharaoh Piye. After the princess died, she was buried in a tomb in Medinet Habu, a marvelous archaeological site near the city of Luxor in Egypt. She was then pillaged by the British, and now the Vatican refuses to give her back to the Sudanese people, who want their princess resting where they say she belongs. The group says the princess isn't an object to be held in the museum of the church, but a person who should be back in her homeland. Sadly, this is just another case of the church holding onto items pillaged from other civilizations and refusing to give them back. What do you think? Should they return the mummy, or is it finders keepers? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Number 1. Canada's Indigenous children. From 1883 to 1998, an estimated 150,000 Indigenous children were taken from their families. These children were kidnapped and forced to attend church-run boarding schools in a desperate attempt by the Canadian government and the Catholic Church to assimilate them into white society. It's a dark stain on both Canada's past and the Church's extremely recent past. A 2015 report from Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission called it a cultural genocide. During those 115 years of forced assimilation, an estimated 3,200 children died attending the residential schools and were then buried in unmarked graves. What do you think is the worst atrocity ever committed by the church? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you next time. Bye!